Dear conference, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to welcome you at the Early Modern Humanist Canons in East Central Europe, Approaches to Reading and Rereading Neo-Latin Texts conference here at the Institute for Musicology of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. In addition to feeling honored, I am also excited since we don't have the opportunity to host the best of early modern research at an international conference here in Budapest every day. It was almost 2 decades ago, back in 2006, when we last held a scientific event on a similar topic in our capital, although that event was much larger in size. We hosted the INLS Congress at that time. Since then, a new generation has dedicated itself to research on late medieval and early modern literature, mainly Neo-Latin literature, so it seemed timely to organize an international conference in Budapest again. We have preserved our series, such as Bibliotheca Scriptorum Medii Recentisque Evorum, a series of critical editions on early modern texts of relevance to the Carpathian Basin, but we have also revived an international journal, Camöni Hungarice, and we have also launched new working groups. These endeavors include the Center for Reformation Studies and the MTA-BTK Lendület Momentum Humanist Canons and Identities Research Group, which provided the topic of this conference. The latter research group was launched in September 2023 at the Reneszánsz section of the Institute for Literary Studies with support from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and it mainly focuses on humanist canons between 1450 and 1630. The work our group of 10 researchers has conducted prompted our plan to discuss our shared Central and Eastern European traditions and literature in a wider scholarly circle, and to engage our particular international scientific circles in shared dialogue, or rather polylogue, in a symposium in the traditional sense. The conference itself was conceived by 2 of my colleagues, Tünde Móri and Eszter Draskóczy, who also took on the lion's share of organizing and arranging the event with the help of Anna Mária Molnár. Enikő Békés, Zsófia Fellegi, and Gábor Palkó have also taken an active role in the preparations, and they are also delivering presentations. Beyond looking at Neo-Latin texts, our research group places equal importance on the comparative examination of the national literatures that emerged during this era. We therefore also wanted to focus on the comparative topics that are fashionable today, going beyond the traditional research topics of Neo-Latin studies. The so-called New Ancient Greek section or the Digital Humanities section fall into this category, and although most of the presentations still examine the late medieval and early modern times, we have opened up the conference to the 18th century in one section, in line with John Monfasani's theory of the long Middle Ages. The next 3 days promise one exciting lecture after the next, which we hope will spark lively debates, comments, and opportunities to connect. My colleagues also intend to lighten up the scientific program. Enikő Békés will take those interested for a walk in the city, and our host, the Institute for Musicology, also offers unique permanent and temporary exhibitions, which I recommend for you to check out during the conference breaks. Last but not least, on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank the National Research, Development and Innovation Office and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences for supporting both our research program and this conference by making this exceptional location available to us. After the welcoming remarks, it is time for us to start the actual work. I would like to briefly introduce our plenary speaker, Lucia Storkova. Lucia, having obtained her doctoral degrees in anthropology and philology and her habilitation in history, She specializes in early modern intellectual history, in particular in the circulation of knowledge and texts in early modern Central Europe. She currently works as a researcher professor at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences and lectures at the Faculty of Humanities, Charles University in Prague. During the last few years, Lucia has participated in several international projects, including cost action projects related to the Europa Humanistica network and ERC programs. She has also recently led a grant project focusing on the complex field of humanist scholarly communities and literary life. The main outcome of this grant was the Companion to Central and Eastern European Humanism, the Czech Glance, which was published by the Gruyter in 2020. Another co-authored volume on Bohemian editors and translators at the turn of the 16th century was published with Prepols in 2021. Her most recent Czech language monograph examines the ways in which the Wittenberg nature of philosophy was adapted to the new cultural and confessional environments in the mid-16th century Bohemian lands. Lucia has given an enigmatic title to her presentation. I think we will have time for short comments after the lecture. And now, Lucia, let me now hand the floor over to you, please, for your presentation.
So thanks so much. Yeah, so many thanks for the very generous introduction, and many thanks to organizers for having invited me here. As you shall see, I'm going to talk about a guy who spent many years in Buda Castle and who really loved the environment. So I think that he would be happy that we just gathered here today for a conference. So for today's lecture, I have chosen a case study of how Bohuslavs of Lobkowicz and Hasselstein was shaped as a canonical writer in the Bohemian lands after the mid-16th century, so approximately 50 years after his death. I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to his life and work, of course, but the main focus of my presentation will be on how a group of humanist editors who had studied in Wittenberg and subsequently settled in Prague undertook a joint project to publish the opera Omnia of a writer a generation older to represent him as a founding figure of a new literary tradition. My main aim is to show how they attempted to shape Hasselstein into such a founding figure and a direct ancestor of their own cultural identity within the paratext of their editions. Although this is a case study from a semi-peripheral region in Central Europe, which at the time was significantly multi-confessional and multilingual, the conceptual framework of the historical formation of literary canons has a much broader scope. Already the first generation of modern Marxist scholars of the literary canon in the 1980s pointed out that it was extremely important in the context of what ideologies the canon was formed and what kinds of exclusion it produced. Whatever the position from which the literary canon is created, a part of the authors is always selected as valuable and then made part of the school curriculum, shared culture memory, and so on, while another part of the authors is rejected as if they had no right to belong to the true or at least high literature. It's therefore not surprising that at various times, in various places, members of ethnic minorities, marginalized or non-conformist religious groups, authors with different sexuality, bodily and mental differences, or in the period before the Second World War, just women could not become part of literary canon. However, being a member of the social elite, such a nobleman, the son of industrialist or a pastor, was not necessarily advantageous in terms of canon formation, as evidenced by post-war history of Central Europe. All these authors were granted the opportunity to write literary works, of course, but these were broadly considered non-canonical texts. As a result, the impression might have arisen that only some social groups wrote valuable literary works and were even intellectually or culturally capable of doing so. This, of course, was the process of social consequences of canon formation in modern times. The story of Bohemian humanists after the mid-16th century differs greatly from these modern stereotypes. As we shall see, the motivations of humanist editors were also linked to the ideas about national community. But as I will attempt to explain with references to Kaspar Hirsch in his research into early modern competition for honor, they were completely different from the creation of a canon as we know it in the era of modern nationalism. The selection was made more in the spirit of culture elitism, so humanists often considered literature written in Latin to be the only high literature, which of course, given the Latin education system of the time, greatly narrowed the group of potential canonical authors. But more on that later. First, few words about Hasselstein himself, to whom future generations related. Bohuslaus of Lobkowicz and Hasselstein came from an aristocratic family and became the most prolific early humanist of the late 15th century in Bohemia. More than 500 of his polished and formally perfect Latin poems, 200 letters, and 3 treatises are known today. Hasselstein studied in Bologna, where Filippo Beroaldo the Elder and the renowned poet Battista Matuano Spagnoli were working at the same time. One of his Bolognese classmates was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and in 1482 he received a doctoral degree in canon law in Ferrara, a basis for a further career as a court official. In the early 1490s, he made an extensive tour of the Mediterranean and the Holy Land, and his clerical career was short-lived. After that, as royal secretary, he was in charge of the personal correspondence of King Vladislav II of Bohemia, and from 1502 to 1503, he worked at the court in Buda, so somewhere here. And after his return, he eventually settled in Hasselstein Castle in northwest Bohemia, where he devoted himself to writing and astronomy, and where he founded a private school for his relatives and other young men from the surrounding towns. At the time of his death, his library, for instance, was truly extensive and admired by his contemporaries. So numbering 650 volumes, it was fully comparable to the libraries of scholars such as Johannes Cuspinianus or Hartmann Schädel, for instance. Today, I will talk about the reflection of his work in the mid-16th century. So I will just briefly add that Hasselstein was, of course, a much discussed figure even in modern times. At that time, his ethnicity and confessional identity were the main topics of discussion because he was a Catholic, which made him a completely different case from the predominant non-Catholic Czech authors of the period before the outbreak of the 30 Years' War. So the Jesuits during the Enlightenment, for example, or conversely Lutheran scholars from Germany took very special approaches to him. There was also much debate as to whether he could be included in the canon of Czech literature at the time of the emerging national movement in the early 19th century, which ultimately did not happen. My dear colleague and friend, Marta Vaculinova, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, has recently dealt with Hasselstein's second life in modern Czech and German national historiography, and according to her research, there are like main themes, let's say, that influenced his later reception. So if you have just a short look on my PowerPoint presentation on this slide, you can see that all these much discussed topics were always somehow related to some kinds of culture identities, let's say from the 17th century onwards. So the first thing, his criticism of the clergy and popes, simply seem to be like very nice to all possible non-Catholic scholars from the 17th century onwards, but he also criticized other things. So yeah, he must have been really like a lovely guy. So he criticized the weak government of Vladislav II, the Hussites, and the unity of Britain, which was of course like just very, which sound very nice to Catholic scholars. He criticized Jews, which sound at the time nice to everybody, with the exception of Jews. And then he criticized all possible classes of Bohemian society, accusing the most prominent men of lacking love for their country, which simply like German poets like in the 19th century. He celebrated the invention of the printing press and gunpowder, which was like a rather neutral topic, I would say. But he also wrote invectives against the translator of his poem into Czech, which simply sounded great again to people who preferred like Latinity as their language and literary tradition. He wrote a very critical letter about Prague and its inhabitants, which were again very popular in German-speaking parts of Bohemian Kingdom. But he also sometimes referred himself as German. It's something what I'm just going to discuss later. And then he also wrote poetry with obscene and erotic content, which was, again, liked by everybody. So let's go back to the mid-16th century. So who were the humanists who undertook the publication of Hasistein's works and began to discuss their significance for literature in the Bohemian lands? Well, without going into a detailed account of the development of Neo-Latin literature in the Bohemian lands, it just suffices to say that in the middle of the 16th century, it was already strongly influenced by the intellectual life at the University of Prague and the everyday functioning of this institution. So in the post-Hussite period, the university's original 4 faculties had been reduced to the Faculty of Arts. This faculty formed a Utraquist institution, and humanist instruction gradually gained ground there from the 1540s until it became a mass affair, let's say. This was owed to a large extent to graduates from Wittenberg, who enriched the tradition of elite aristocratic humanism in Bohemia with the literary practices and knowledge of the physical world they had acquired in Germany. After studying at the Universities of Prague and Wittenberg, they often settled in the capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia and worked as teachers in town schools or officials or professors at the university. The collective literary projects by former Wittenberg students became the platform through which the Wittenberg poetic tradition was transferred to the university environment. Among other things, this group published the first Latin textbooks, dictionaries, and grammars, as well as collections of occasional poetry such as Epitalamia, Genetliaca, and Epicedia. They also tried their hand at writing poems aimed at various types of patrons, from city councils to the imperial court. Their joint projects included also a plan to publish the works of older humanists active around 1500. Their plan was to present local poets and the spread of education from Italy to the Transalpine regions to prove the quality of Bohemian scholars. In Hasistein's lifetime, hardly any of his works were published in print, but this was only taken up 50 years later by Thomas Smithies, himself a very prolific author and religious poet. And between 1561 and 1570, he edited in 5 volumes the complete writings of Hasistein known at that time, so his Latin poetry, speeches, treatises, and letters. And this will be my main source today. Just a few words to the conceptual framework I'm going to use. Well, following the concepts of Kaspar Hirschi, I aim to show in my paper what role the literary canon formation could have played in the early stages of the humanist, the so-called competition for national honor. The strategies used to shape the image of Hasistein as a canonical author were linked to a specific type of early modern national belonging. As is known, Hirschi emphasizes that the early modern nations were formed through a competition over symbolic values. Although he rejected modernist conception of nationalism, his approach in some respects resembles Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities. Nations as abstract communities endowed with a specific honor, so as Ehrgemeinschaften, evolved from particular corporation at the end of the 15th century in a process associated with the literary activities of small groups of intellectuals who drove the discourse, I quote, that creates and preserves the nation as an autonomous value. Hence, as Hirschi puts it, the nation was, quote again, a political, cultural and linguistic community inhabiting a territory of its own and sharing an exclusive honor among its members. In this sense, early modern nationalism is, I quote, an all-encompassing contest for honor between these abstract communities. Therefore, we can also speak of humanist agonistic discourse of the nation. Hirschi emphasizes that the early modern nations were formed through a competition, beginning in the late Middle Ages over symbolic values such as honor and shame. This was a dynamic process because other participants in this contest supplied more and more arguments for the humanists to address in the name of their community of honor. The relatively equal nature of this competition, however, does not mean that the humanist debate was not based on the notion of hierarchical relationships between societies. Humanists work primarily with the dichotomy of civilization and barbarism, attacking the backwardness of their enemies and defending their own community's level. In their competition for honor, humanists focus on the specific qualities of their community. Their approach was reflected in debates on topics related to the fields of history, so diverse communities could boast different historical narratives or different contacts with ancient civilizations and so on. But they also related them to contemporary topography, climate, national wealth, political organization, and the level of craftsmanship and education in different countries. Very frequently, the competition for national honor concerned everyday customs and the general culture and moral qualities of the given region's inhabitants. And logically, part of this honor was also the literary history of the community, and whether it could offer certain types of personalities around whom competitive imagery could be developed and who could form a canonical series leading to the present. Hasselstein became just such a figure. According to Hirschi, the formation of early modern nations had a major impact on the social status of those who created them. It was the intellectuals that had the skills and knowledge necessary to compete for honor, including the knowledge of the political and cultural heritage of ancient Rome as a single universal power. They could become the lay priest, as he says, of national community, which also allowed them to strengthen their direct links to spheres of power, for instance, to the ruler and his court. The competition for honor, in turn, added prestige to their literary activity. As Albert Schemeister pointed out many years ago, in this regard, texts concerning national honor were a very successful means of moving in the literary field and gaining support. Thus, the humanist scholars claimed honor for other members of the abstract community, and in doing so, they gained recognition for their work, and also resources related to it. As I have already shown in other contexts, Hirschi's concept does not sufficiently take into account the differences between various European regions. The first images of foreign lands were formed by Italian humanists on the basis of comparison with their homeland. These images in turn provoked a reaction among humanists from the Transalpine regions, especially from the German lands and France. Yet, the agonistic discourse of the nation also opened up additional possibilities for humanists from the semi-peripheral regions of Central and Eastern Europe. The case of how Hasselstein was represented show that the establishment of the literary canon and canonical authors could also have been part of this intellectual competition. The humanists refuted the charge of barbarism not only through argument, but also through their ability to write in a sophisticated style. This is particularly important when it comes to editions of earlier humanists and their paratextual material. Editorial activities and creation of literary canon in the name of a community of honor would thus have a very high degree of legitimacy. The Wettkampf der Nationen produced a large number of humanist texts, but editions and their paratexts belong among the most privileged ways of presenting one's own literary history and one's own literary quality to foreign scholars. The early phase of the humanist competition for honor in Bohemia began with the first collections of occasional poetry, continued with the anthologies of local poetry, and culminated in Thomas Mitty's extensive editorial project to make Hasselstein known, works available, and celebrating this author as their immediate predecessor, who proved the high level of civility and education in the Bohemian lands already at the turn of the century. This was precisely the main motive behind his presentation as a founder of a new literary tradition. It's likely that Thomas Mitys had planned to publish the works of various Bohemian humanists active around 1500, which would have been a welcome argument in the competition for honor, but his plans were abandoned for financial reasons. An edition of the work Bohemiae et Procerum eius Laudes by Hieronymus Balbus, an Italian humanist active in Vienna and elsewhere, was procured by Laurentius Spahn as early as 1560. It contains, among other texts, Balbus's extensive poem De Patria Bohuslavi Bohemia, so about Bohemia, homeland of Bohuslav of Hasselstein. This offered Bohemian humanists the opportunity to present a text that was written by a contemporary of Hasselstein and provides a systematic description of his country, Bohemia, and the manners of its inhabitants. I quote, "I must honor the land which was fated to carry such a poet," Balbus writes, suggesting that what he found interesting about Bohemia was that a humanist poet born and living there was able to compete with foreign authors. As concerns Mitty's edition of Hasselstein's complete works appearing from 1561 to 1570, this must have been a very time-consuming project. Besides the texts themselves, Mitys also provided a large amount of paratextual material that has been neglected by modern researchers, such as encomiastic poems, biographical sketches, quotations, excerpts from letters and other texts by Hasselstein's contemporaries and later scholars. All of this was to prove that Hasselstein was indeed not only the greatest Bohemian poet to date, as he says the country has not yet produced a similar or another such poet, but also to show that he was on a par with the greatest of European humanist authors. At the same time, it enabled Mitys and his contemporaries to present their own intellectual skills and contacts. Their aim was thus not only to preserve the memory of their famous predecessor, but also to involve his life and work in the defense of the newly emerging community of honor and its literary life. Hasselstein's detailed biography, Vita per Mittem Collecta, was already incorporated in the 1563 edition of the Orations. So as the title suggests, Mitys had to compile this biography. Besides the biographical narrative, it consisted of statements attributed to Hasselstein and, above all, testimonies about him. Throughout the editorial project, Mitys used statements from foreign authorities, so-called externi viri, in his creation of a new canonical figure. Concerning Hasselstein, there was purportedly a consensus among many scholars, so consensus multorum eruditorum, headed by the aforementioned Hieronymus Balbus, Augustinus Moravus, Erasmus Pinifer, and Ulrich von Hutten. According to Hasselstein's contemporaries, it was thanks to him that the Bohemian lands began to excel not only in warfare, but also in rhetoric and literature. In the editions, Hasselstein is presented as an unquestionable authority to whom his contemporaries turned with requests to assess their writings as to the, as they say, prince of scholars. So ut pute ad principem literarum. According to Mateusz Kolinus, one of the most active proponents of Wittenberg humanism in Prague, scholars working at the University of Prague around 1500 were barely able to write a few lines, and the noblemen were not great scholars either. Hasselstein, however, was a different case altogether. Mitty's edition represents him as a nobleman who, thanks to his education, eschewed the lifestyle of the aristocracy of the time. Based on Fabricius's letter, he was a unique phenomenon among the nobility. As Fabricius puts it, he, I quote, was no lesser than any learned man of his time, more noble than many, and the most skilled and knowledgeable of them all. In addition to his admirable intellectual skills, Hasselstein was unique in what he spent his money on as an aristocrat, namely on the support of literary activities instead of dissolute excesses, in regard of which the contemporary nobility could learn from him, of course. The confessional aspect of the entire editorial project is also interesting. As Marta Vaculinová has recently pointed out, non-Catholic editors focused on certain aspects of Hasselstein's work more than the others. For example, Mitys drew attention to his criticism of the papacy in the margins, but he chose not to include the letter to Christian Pedig about Prague, in which Hasselstein criticized the radical Hussite army led by Jan Žižka. Similarly, he did not include letters in which Hasselstein expressed negative opinions about the people of Prague and very strongly asserted his Catholic position. In line with what I mentioned earlier, when edited the letters to King Vladislaus, he totally omitted passages in which Hasselstein criticized Bohemia at the time, as this would have been contrary to his effort to make him a canonical figure of new emerging literature in this region. The period before Hasselstein can be described using the category of barbarism and the fight against it. Hasselstein allegedly brought the Muses to cold Bohemia and, on his long journeys, acquired for the Bohemians previously unknown classical authors. In fact, in one of his edited poems addressed to Balbus, he himself writes precisely about the cold and barbarism of the Czech land. I quote, "You seek out Arctic and eternal cold and rejoice at living in our barbaric land." He needs to protect the Muses from the contempt of the people and savage and terrible barbarians. So he writes about herd of barbarians, the great number of worst possible barbarians, and so on. The situation in the Bohemian lands, however, changed radically under his influence, and Hasselstein's poems are the best evidence against the charge of barbarism. Mitty's edition quotes Fabricius recalling how reading Hasselstein's poem made his professor at the University of Bologna change his opinion of the inhabitants of the Transalpine regions, so-called provinciales homines, and stop considering them barbarians. Hasselstein became a light for the whole country, and later poets were like stars that reflect this light. Spahn writes that Hasselstein was born, I quote, "in those times when full barbarity was oppressing education and learning, when the ornamental style had only developed in Italy. From the viewpoint of the humanist building of literary canon, This means that Hasselstein, as a representative of the Bohemian nation, was directly comparable to Italian poets, the successors of the classical literary tradition. According to mid-century humanists, Hasselstein was a competitor to the Italians themselves, even surpassing them in talent and diligence. This made him famous beyond the borders of the Kingdom of Bohemia. I quote again, "He is the one, thanks to whom the barbarian and lands competes with Italian poets. He is the one whom beautiful Apollo favors." So this is what writes Simonus Fagellus Villaticus about Hasselstein. What this agonistic motive does not mean, however, is that Hasselstein, as a new canonical figure, participated in the competition for national honor in its radical multipolar form, as Kaspar Hirsi assumed. As Hasselstein's editors saw it, there was a country whose scholars were not in competition with Hasselstein and his successors. On the contrary, they considered them as colleagues of some sort. And this was Germania, especially the areas bordering Bohemia. Therefore, in excerpts from the correspondence between Georg Fabricius and his Bohemian friends, we encounter the idea of Fabricius's affection for Bohemia and their shared enthusiasm for working together on the presentation and celebration of the Bohemian nation. They use such phrases as affections of the soul, propensio animi, ardent desire to adorn our nation and make it known to foreign nations, and gentle kindness of our nation, and so on. The paratexts also repeatedly emphasize that close connections between the editor and his co-workers and Wittenberg. Although Hasselstein was a Catholic and even aspired to the post of bishop, Bohemian humanists celebrated him by quoting authors of various denominations, including their former Wittenberg professors. Mittis and his co-workers distinguish, of course, between Bohemia and Germania. For them, Hasselstein was Natione Bohemus, not Natione Germanus. Indeed, they also edited some celebratory quotations from foreign authors to reflect this. In one of Mittis's letters, he is described as our Hasselstein, so Noster Hasselsteinius, whereas Fabricius in his reply refers to him as your hero, Heros Vester. Yet, when it was desirable in terms of celebratory representation, they did not hesitate to associate the Bohemian and German lands in one imaginary country. They could thus praise Hasselstein's library, which was allegedly the best and most numerous, surpassing the libraries in all Germania. In support of their argument, they did not hesitate to include a quotation from a letter by David Chytreus, saying that Hasselstein, as a new canonical figure, was the most gifted and stylistically most sophisticated poet in the whole of Germania at that time. So, what can be concluded from all that? Bohemian scholars did not enter the competition until relatively late, so shortly before 1550. When the first poems praising the quality of local Latin education appeared, and humanists began to celebrate authors active around 1500 as their immediate predecessors. The situation in Western Europe around 1550 was entirely different, according to Hirschi. After a previous phase during which images of foreign countries were created and comparisons drawn with them, in the middle of the century, intellectual competition entered a phase of political propaganda, consolidation, and real political struggle. Bohemian humanist editors offered a general conception of Bohemia, its civility, and the competitiveness of their poets in relation to foreign countries. Their main aim was to present the intellectual and literary qualities of Bohemian poets. Therefore, its conception was still not inclusive. It had not yet developed a language and discourse of honor that would allow for the inclusion of different classes of population of the Bohemian lands. According to Hirschi, this earlier concept of honor was closely linked to the distinctions in the late medieval society, whereas the language of national honor and shame from the 16th to 17th centuries made it possible to integrate almost all social groups living in a particular territory. As we have seen, it's also typical of Bohemian editors that they do not completely reject foreign culture and intellectual influences. Conversely, they develop the idea of the transfer of a new type of literature, a new type of poetry, and that they do not compete with all foreign regions. On the contrary, they emphasize the positive link between Bohemia and the German lands and the scholars there. The shift is already evident within editions of authors active around 1500 that contain clear historical narrative and give space to foreign voices in the paratexts. These could be celebratory quotations from the works or letters of foreign authors, for example. The 1560 edition of Hieronymus Balbus included pieces which not only were written by a contemporary of Hasselstein, but they also provided a systematic description of the land and the characteristics of their inhabitants. A much greater response was obtained by Philip Melanchthon's praise of the growing level of education in the Bohemian lands and the Henneti as a direct ancestors of the Bohemian nation. Against the background of this interpretation, we can already see how an idea was emerging of the Bohemians as an abstract community of honor. Most specifically, the editors highlighted links with Wittenberg and Melanchthon, for example, as the most significant teaching figure of the generation. Germania is represented as a place from which the achievements of civilization are transferred to Bohemian lands. At the same time, it is a space adhering to similar values and of spiritual affinity, which does not compete with the Bohemian lands. The inspiring quality of humanist poetry in Hungary is mentioned also once as well. Nevertheless, this cooperation also applies within the community of honor and co-determines who is a member. If we were to use modern terminology, the community established and described by the humanist poets and their editorial work would not be Czech, but Bohemian. So it's related to Bohemia, its qualities, its past, and its ties to ancient civilization, but it is not associated with one's primary linguistic competence before receiving a Latin education. In this period, the Bohemian lands were not only a multi-confessional and also a multi-ethnic and multilingual territory. Around 1560, scholarly communication here was conducted in Latin, of course, and some of the Bohemian poets at this time came from German-speaking areas of the Bohemian lands and did not speak Czech. Yet these are quite naturally included in the community of honor, defined also by the shared literary history. For example, Georg Hanč, one of Métis's closest friends and collaborators, came from the town of Lipa, today Česká Lípa, and did not learn Czech until he was an adult after his arrival at the University of Prague. The humanist conception of a nation as an abstract community of honor thus transcended the ethnic and linguistic boundaries of the time. From this perspective, it was not a problem to make Hasselstein, who professed his culture ties to Germany, a founding and canonical figure of this newly emerging literary tradition, especially since the editors defined themselves as graduates of German universities. From this perspective, it was not so significant that Hasselstein's famous words ego me Germanum did not refer in that particular letter to patriotic sentiments, but to the fact that he felt like a citizen of the Roman Empire, which he understood as the last chain of the transmission of the Roman power. All this is even more interesting if we consider how vehemently the Czech national movement after 1800 worked with a negative and even hateful image of everything German, including its closest neighbors, and especially the German-speaking population living in the same country for centuries. It's also significant in terms of Hasistein's position in the modern canon of the Czech literature. This canon was based on modern nationalism and differs significantly from the humanist approach, if only because it rejected all German and other culture influences. At the beginning of the 19th century, Daniel Adam Ofeleslavin and his excellent translations from Latin into Czech from the 1580s and 1590s became a part of the canonical history of Czech literature, but not Hasistein. The concept of so-called national humanism after the Second World War, influenced by soft Marxist literary historians, also played a role in this. Dividing humanism into branches, the so-called national and Latin one, it claimed that the humanist Latin works should not be part of Czech literature because they were elitist, did not focus on the broad audience, and did not respond to current social problems. Of course, it does not correspond to reality at all, if only because a large part of the humanist authors participated in writing in all languages, so Latin, Czech, and German. Latin was the basic language of education even for townspeople, and everyone sought the patronage of the nobility, and everyone responded to current social issues regardless of language. Well, today, the situation is even more complicated. Over the last 30 years, the concept of canon base of the 19th century tradition has begun to crumble, and any literature written before 1800 finds it difficult to find a place in it. Not Hasistein, but several other names do, however, meet one of the possible definitions of belonging to the literary canon. These are canonical authors such as Jan Amos Comenius, for instance, whose name and basic life story are known to children from schools, but whose works, despite or perhaps because of this, no one reads. In any case, this shows how the question of canon formation and its ideological backgrounds was and still is important for the production of various cultural belongings.